All right, I think we can get started. So good evening, everyone. I'm Agnes Burt, Program Director at New Hampshire Humanities, and I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's Humanities at Home Rescue Board, the Untold Story of America's Efforts to Save the Jews of Europe. Today, if you didn't know, is International Holocaust Memorial Day, which marks the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp in Poland in 1945. So for tonight's program, Dr. Rebecca Erbelding will focus on the War Refugee Board, a U.S. government agency that was established late in the war in 1944 to save the remaining Jewish people of Europe. The board staff, predominantly Treasury Department lawyers, opened a refugee camp in upstate New York, started a psychological warfare campaign, sent false papers into enemy territory, negotiated ransom offers with Nazis, and ultimately saved tens of thousands of lives. NHH programs like this one are made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as donations from supporters like you. In 2022, New Hampshire Humanities supported over 500 free programs in 122 New Hampshire communities across all 10 counties. These range from public lectures and discussions, book discussions at your local library, museum exhibits, and story walks, just to name a few. If you would like to continue to support our work, learn more about upcoming programs, or sign up for our e-news, please visit our website, nhhumanities.org. Before we begin, I also want to remind you of the general Zoom features for this presentation. As always, we welcome your participation and comments during the program. We will save time for questions at the end of the presentation. Throughout the program, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box and your comments in the chat. I will keep track of everybody's questions and we will return to them at the end of the program. Additionally, throughout the presentation, we expect that all participants will abide by the general rules of respectful civil discourse. We expect that all comments and questions, whether typed in the chat or expressed verbally, will be based on the content of the program and further a productive conversation between participants, presenters, and NHH staff. If anyone experiences any technical difficulty, please send the host a direct message and a member of NHH staff will try to assist you. And as one last note, please be aware that we are recording this program and it will be available on our website for viewing in the coming weeks. So with all of the administrative business out of the way, it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Rebecca Erbelding. Her book, Rescue Board, The Untold Story of America's Efforts to Save the Jews of Europe, won the National Jewish Book Award for Excellence in Writing based on archival research. She and her work are featured in the 2022 PBS documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust, directed by Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Botstein, a film for which she also served as historical advisor. She holds a PhD in American history from George Mason University and has been a historian, curator, and archivist at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum since 2003. So Rebecca, please take it away.
No, thank you so much for everyone for having me and for coming on a Friday night. I'm going to share my screen in the hopes that you now see the cover of my book. The subtitle of my book, I think, surprises a lot of people, this idea that the untold story of America's efforts to save the Jews of Europe. And it's a little more told now since my book came out in 2018. I've been doing a lot of talks, so hopefully some people have heard of the War Refugee Board. And if you watched the film, The U.S. and the Holocaust on PBS, there's a whole section in the third episode about the War Refugee Board. So I'm really hoping that this story starts to be one that we talk about more because I think it is interesting and important. As a country, we've had, I think, a very simplified idea about the United States and the Holocaust. Often when I would go out to speak, I would find that people would either assume that the United States knew nothing about what was happening in Europe during World War II, that liberation was a complete surprise, or conversely, the cynics would say, well, the United States knew everything, but was too anti-Semitic to do anything about it. And there are various truths in both of those statements, but neither of them are entirely true. You know, the United States is not one thing. The United States does not speak with one voice. There are people who are paying attention for years to what is happening. And there is information out there about what is happening to Jews as it is happening. Some Americans make extraordinary efforts, as you'll see, and most Americans are much more focused on the war effort. So history is just much more complicated than either of those kind of simplistic ideas. In reality, as I said, Americans had quite a lot of information about the Nazi persecution of Jews. In the spring of 1933, it is headline news throughout the United States that the Nazis are burning books, that they're kicking Jews out of the civil service, and they are boycotting Jewish-owned businesses. And again, this is headline news in March, April, May 1933, right next to, as you can see, reports on the end of Prohibition and the beginning of beer sales in the United States, reports on Roosevelt coming into office in the beginning of the New Deal and the beginning of the first 100 days. You can see here the Portsmouth Herald, which has a picture of protests in New York City in March 1938. So Hitler has been in power. He's been Chancellor of Germany for less than 2 months at this point. And you see the lower headline, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but down here, developments in Germany watched, mass meetings and protests held throughout the world. These protests go on all spring. There are over 500 petitions that are sent to the State Department, to people's congressional representatives, to the White House, asking for the United States to do something about what Americans are seeing happening in Germany. This is an example from Bayonne, New Jersey. This is, again, March 28th, 1933, the same day as the article you just saw. And it says here, whereas we have learned from unquestionable, authentic sources of the many outrages perpetrated by the National Socialists of Germany against Jews and other minorities, of the unwanted invasion of peaceful homes, of the desecration of synagogues and cemeteries, of brutal physical assaults, murder and looting, of illegal arrests and tortures, and of the circulation of vicious libels designed to poison the minds of the ignorant. This is the spring of 1933. Mass murder will not begin for another 8 years. And Americans, if they're paying attention, and many Americans in the spring of 1933 were paying attention, they could know that things are not looking good for Jews in Germany. The challenge is that Americans have a very short attention span. And after the spring of 1933, it kind of falls off the front pages. And for most of the mid-1930s, Americans stop paying attention. They pay attention again at Kristallnacht, November 9th and 10th, 1938, when Nazi Germany starts a pogrom, basically, throughout Germany, and which now includes Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia. They're burning synagogues, 30,000 Jewish men and boys are arrested, Jewish-owned shops are looted, Jewish-owned homes are destroyed. You can see, again, the Portsmouth Herald, November 10th, 1938, Jewish synagogues destroyed in Berlin is one of the main headlines. This is also the 20th anniversary of the end of World War I, November 11th, 1938. It's also the week of the midterm elections. And so you see that a bigger headline is Jewish synagogues destroyed in Germany, and below that, in smaller font, post-election rally checked. I have seen papers where the major headline, large font is Kristallnacht, and much smaller will be the results of Senate campaigns. The idea that Kristallnacht is displacing the midterm elections as the main story shows you what a big deal this was. This news, and it will be news in the United States for about 3 weeks as Americans start to understand what the Nazis are doing with Kristallnacht, that they are trying to force Jews to emigrate, that they are stealing Jewish wealth, actually taxing the Jewish community to pay for the destruction of the synagogues and to pay for the cleanup. Americans are trying to reckon with this and wrestle with it. But although there is widespread sympathy, there is not widespread agreement that we should be bringing in more immigrants into the United States. That even though Germany is clearly trying to force Jews to leave, they're making life so miserable for Jews that they will want to go. The United States is not going to open its doors to become a haven. These two polls were both taken right after Kristallnacht, about 2.5 weeks later. And you can see the poll on the left, do you approve or disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany? 94% of Americans disapprove of what the Nazis are doing. And then the same people are asked, should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the United States to live? And 72% of those people say no. So there is sympathy, but not a willingness to be part of the solution. And at this time, the United States had no refugee policy. we only had an immigration policy. So you could not come to the United States as a refugee, as an asylum seeker, or as a migrant. You could only come through this slow, deliberate immigration process that is not made any easier in the wake of this humanitarian crisis. As we know, Germany invaded Poland in September 1938. World War II begins. Americans are urged to leave areas of war. And so from 1938 on, and then certainly by 1940 and 1941, as Germany is expanding, as the territory is getting more dangerous, in 1941, as they invade the Soviet Union in June, there are fewer and fewer reporters on the ground inside Europe reporting on what they are seeing. And so while there's quite a lot of information in 1933, and then again in 1938, and a little bit in 1939, by 1940 and 1941, there really isn't a lot of first-person reporting about what is happening, particularly what is happening on the battlefronts in Eastern Europe. So just as Jews are being forced into ghettos, just as mass shooting is beginning in Eastern Europe, there are fewer and fewer Americans bearing witness to these events. And Americans are at that point having heated debates over whether we should get involved in a war, whether we should supply the Allies, whether we should remain isolated. And so the few reports that do come out are fairly small. They are inside newspapers, and they're reporting on mass shootings. You know, this town was wiped out. These people were reported to have been murdered. And that phrase, reported to have been, is really key for Americans. Most of these reports are coming out of the Polish government in exile or the Soviet Union. And those are two sources Americans do not trust. They don't trust them politically, and they feel like these are two sources that are just trying to draw us into the war. And how are they drawing us into the war? They're talking about the murder of women and children, and they're talking about the murder of communities. And why would the Nazis be doing this? Aren't they trying to win a war? Of course they're not doing this. This is a propaganda ploy. That is what I think most Americans are thinking at this point. And so they're very easy to dismiss the reports that are coming out of Europe. So in 1942, this changes. And my book, Rescue Board, is really about what happens from this moment on. In the summer of 1942, Gerhard Riegner, who was a 30-year-old German-Jewish lawyer who had escaped into Switzerland and was the representative of the World Jewish Congress, which was an organization based in New York. He learned third hand from a German businessman that all of these rumors about mass killing in the East, about all of the things that people were witnessing, deportations in Western Europe of perfectly healthy people to Eastern Europe, all of those things had a purpose. And that purpose was that the Nazis had a plan to murder all of the Jews of Europe. And again, this seems really obvious to us now. But in 1942, it was fairly unfathomable to many, many Americans. So there's no precedent to this. There isn't even the word genocide at this point. And so Riegner tries to send his information through the State Department in Geneva, which had a secure communications channel with the United States. So Riegner did not want to originally send his information just through the mail. That could get intercepted. He tries to send it through the State Department, where it can be censored and then uncensored once it comes to the US. The State Department officials in Washington block the message from delivery. They refuse to deliver it to the World Jewish Congress headquarters in New York. And the reason that they say so is one says, this is too fantastical to be true. Another says it is just a war rumor and there's no sense in getting people riled up. And another says, I don't understand why you put this sort of thing in a telegram. Riegner's information gets out. If it hadn't gotten out through him, it would have gotten out another way. He eventually gets it to London, and then the representatives in London send it via Western Union, which is what you see here, to New York, to Stephen Wise, who was the head of the World Jewish Congress and one of the most influential rabbis in America. And you can see that it says, at Führer's headquarters, plan discussed and under consideration, all Jews in countries occupied or controlled by Germany, number 3.5 to 4 million, should after deportation and concentration in East, at one blow exterminated, to resolve once and for all Jewish question in Europe. So the news gets out. And by November 1942, the State Department has actually confirmed this information. You can see in the center and on the left, 2 of those confirmations, and you can see that they're fairly small articles. And they say about 2 million Jews have been murdered, and this extermination campaign is ongoing. Despite the small size of the articles, they make a big stir, particularly among the Jewish community in the United States and really throughout the world, in South America, in Asia, even the small Jewish communities in Africa pay attention to this information now coming out. This is the moment where you can say, from here on, this information is treated as credible. If you look on the right, you see that there's enough pressure at this point that by mid-December 1942, the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and a number of nations in exile have issued a statement about this. They are condemning this, as they call it, cold-blooded policy, or policy of cold-blooded extermination. And they are promising war crimes trials after the war. They do not promise any sort of rescue. They promise war crimes trials. One of the reasons that they don't promise rescue is that at this point, 6 weeks earlier, the Allies had landed in North Africa. They are thousands of miles away from the killing centers, which is where most people are being murdered at this point. And so the Allies decide there's nothing we can do about this now. We are going to condemn it. We are going to threaten the perpetrators, and we are going to move on and try to fight this war. And for more than a year after that, there's more and more information trickling out of Europe, and that information is now treated by the press as credible. The State Department consistently tries to quell any sort of public pressure for rescue, but activists are staging marches, they are staging rallies and stage shows, they are placing full-page newspaper ads throughout the country, condemning the Roosevelt administration for not doing enough, condemning the State Department for being anti-Semitic. In 1943, in October, you can see here, hundreds of Orthodox rabbis march on the US Capitol, demanding some sort of rescue response. Nobody's quite sure what a rescue response would look like, but clearly if smart people got together in a room, clearly something could have been done. At this point, mass rescue actually not possible. The Allies only have a tenuous grasp on the European continent. They finally secure North Africa in May, move on to Sicily, and then finally into the boot of Italy. But they are very far away from Nazi-occupied Poland, which is where the killing centers are located. But this is a point where more could have been done. More pressure could have been put on neutral nations, more avenues of escape for people who are on the margins of Nazi territory. Things that the War Refugee Board eventually will do could have been done in 1943. But at this point in the story, a group of Treasury Department lawyers enter the picture, kind of very unlikely heroes. They had spent the fall of 1943 being very frustrated by the State Department. In the summer of 1943, they had decided that there was enough information coming out of Europe that they would start to allow small amounts of humanitarian aid, like $25,000, not a lot of money, even in 1943, small amounts of humanitarian aid to go to Jewish communities in Europe outside of the US sanctions program. So the US had a very rudimentary sanctions program beginning in 1940. And by 1943, the Treasury Department is willing to say, even if this money falls into the hands of the Nazis, it's not going to change the course of the war. And the humanitarian crisis seems massive. And so let's get some small amount of money out there through the sanctions program. The State Department consistently delays that. They delay approval of that for 5 months. Even though it's really the Treasury Department's call, the State Department just refuses to transmit the permission into Europe, which again, they control the communications. And so this Treasury Department starts to put together a report of all of the evidence that they're finding. You know, we said this and then the State Department said no, and we did this and the State Department said no. And while they're investigating, in December 1943, finally, they learn that the State Department officials had purposely tried to stop information about the Holocaust from reaching the United States. That information was trickling out to the activists, and the State Department made the determination that if the United States and the American people did not know what was happening in Europe, they would stop pressuring the US government to do more. They specifically wanted to sanction any of Gerhard Rigner's reports. He should not be allowed to send any reports about atrocities to the United States anymore. So the Treasury Department discovers this. One of the best things about studying the Treasury Department is that Henry Morgenthau Jr. was FDR's Treasury Secretary. So he was not a money guy. He actually didn't even have a college education, but he was an incredible manager. He really recognized talent and promoted his staff and trusted his staff. And he was a fantastic record keeper. So one of the best resources that we have about the Roosevelt administration are the so-called Morgenthau diaries. These are every piece of paper that crossed Henry Morgenthau's desk in his 11 years as Treasury Secretary, as well as transcripts of almost all of his meetings. And so you could actually, and I did, go through and I can read in actually what people said in these meetings. It was either recorded by a stenographer or they had these little records that could record voices and then they would be transcribed later. And so at the end of December 1943, Josiah Du Bois, who was a Treasury Department lawyer, says in one of these meetings to the secretary, "Mr. Secretary, the only question we have in our mind, I think, is the bull has to be taken by the horns in dealing with this Jewish issue and get this thing out of the State Department into some agency's hands that's willing to deal with it frontally. For instance, take the complaint, what are we going to do with the Jews? We let them die because we don't know what to do with them." And then Randolph Paul, who was the Treasury Department's general counsel, added, "We are speaking as citizens now." And when I found that, I found it incredibly powerful. This idea that these very high-ranking Treasury officials are saying, this is not a policy position, this is not a political move. We are citizens in a democracy, and we think our country is better than what the State Department is doing. And so armed with all of this evidence, they write a new report. This is one of the drafts of the report. This is one of the draft titles, Personal Report to the President on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jewish Population in Europe. This report begins, "One of the greatest crimes in history, the slaughter of the Jewish people in Europe, is continuing unabated. Unless remedial steps of a drastic nature are taken and taken immediately, I am certain that no effective action will be taken by this government to prevent the complete extermination of the Jews in German-controlled Europe, and that this government will have to share for all time responsibility for this extermination." So they go to Roosevelt with this. On January 16th, 1944, Morgenthau and two members of his staff meet with Roosevelt and convince him to issue Executive Order 9417, which establishes a War Refugee Board. It removes the issue of refugees out of the hands of the State Department and creates this new government agency tasking it with rescue and relief. They say, do anything you want as long as it does not interfere with what they called the successful prosecution of the war. So as long as you are not delaying Allied victory, you should do all measures in your power to rescue and provide relief to Nazi victims. It is officially headed by the Secretaries of War, State, and Treasury, but it is completely a Treasury Department operation in terms of staff. They are housed on the third floor of the Treasury Department. Almost all of the staff come out of the Treasury Department, including the first director of the War Refugee Board, John Paley, who was 35 years old. He was born in Minneapolis, raised in Omaha, Nebraska, the child of immigrants, and was not of the moneyed class of the State Department. He had made his way to Yale and then down to DC to work at the Treasury Department. And he had been the man in charge of the US sanctions program. So beginning in 1940, he was in charge of about $8 billion, and that is in 1940s money, $8 billion worth of seized and blocked assets from Nazi Germany, the countries that invaded, and its allies and collaborators, including Japan. And so this is a man who had a very serious and very important job prior to this, and leaves that job to take over as the director of the War Refugee Board. So for the first time in 1944, the United States has a policy about the Holocaust. It is a policy of rescue and relief. And by the end of the war in Europe, 17 months later, the War Refugee Board had undoubtedly saved tens of thousands of lives. They tried so many different ideas and had projects in dozens of countries. And so it's really hard to really come up with a list or a pithy summary for you of everything that they did. So I'm going to give you some overall facts and then just tell you a couple of stories. But if there's anything you know about that you want me to talk about later, we can get into that in the Q&A. So the same day in January 1944 that Roosevelt creates the War Refugee Board, the staff, the first thing that they did is they streamlined the process of humanitarian aid, the process that relief agencies could use to send money into Europe. They argued that it no longer mattered if the money fell into the hands of the enemy in light of the humanitarian crisis. So they are now by-stepping the State Department entirely. By the end of the war, they had authorized about $11 million, which is about $170 million today in humanitarian aid. And that was on behalf of a host of aid organizations. It was used to buy guns for the French underground. It was used to create false papers. It was used to pay off border guards to help people escape into safer territory. It was used to buy food for children in hiding. The board also appointed representatives in the neutral nations of Europe, in Turkey, in Switzerland, in Sweden, in Portugal. They tried to put somebody in Spain. They had someone in North Africa, and they eventually had someone in London. And those people's jobs was to put pressure on those neutral nations. They are leveraging what is now certain to be Allied victory. By the spring of 1944, it's pretty clear that the Allies are eventually going to win. The Nazis have been in retreat for over a year. And so putting pressure on those governments and saying, now is the time to get on the side of the United States. And this is something that we care about. This is something you can help us out about. You can protest the Nazi treatment of Jews. You can pass on information that your diplomats are seeing on the ground in those countries. Because as neutral nations, they still had diplomats in Poland, in Germany. You can allow more refugees over your borders. And so from Washington, Paley is looking around and he comes up with his strategy. His strategy is to persuade the Nazis and their collaborators to stop the killing, and then to rescue all of the people who can be saved, right? Move the people who are on the margins of Nazi territory to areas of safety, and for people who are deep inside Nazi territory in areas like Germany and Poland, to do whatever they could to keep these people alive as long as possible, to keep them alive long enough for the Allied armies to come and liberate them. So I'm going to give you an example of each one. The War Refugee Board launched a propaganda warfare campaign using radio broadcasts and leaflets. They targeted would-be perpetrators, so sending radio broadcasts into Nazi-controlled territory, dropping leaflets from airplanes. They're largely warnings and threats, promising that these perpetrators would be brought to justice after the war. And as you see up here, on March 24th, 1944, FDR issues a statement that was written by the War Refugee Board. And it begins very similarly to the report that they gave him back in January. In one of the blackest crimes of all history, begun by the Nazis in the day of peace and multiplied by them 100 times in time of war, the wholesale murder of the Jews of Europe goes on unabated every hour. So March 24th, 1944 is only a few days after the Nazi invasion and the German invasion of Hungary. Hungary had the largest, largely intact Jewish population in Europe, the largest and last, really. There are about 800,000 people still in Hungary, 600,000 Hungarian Jews, and 200,000 people who had escaped to what they hoped would be safety in Hungary. And so when Germany invades, the War Refugee Board panics, and they quickly add a new paragraph to Roosevelt's statement that reads, as a result of the events of the last few days, hundreds of thousands of Jews who, while living under persecution, have at least found a haven from death in Hungary and the Balkans, are now threatened with annihilation. That these innocent people should perish on the very eve of triumph would be a major tragedy. It's very hard, of course, to estimate the effects of psychological warfare. We can't say, oh, these number of people were saved because the perpetrator was deterred from murdering them. But what we can say is I found this leaflet with the help of an elderly German man who remembers finding it in his town after an Allied bombing raid in April 1944. So he's the one who turned me on to what it looked like and enabled me to help find it. This type of leaflet was very smartly done. So what the Allies would tend to do is they would have something like this on one side, and then on the other side, they would have reports of local bombing raids. And so you on the ground would know that that side was true. You're on the ground, that factory did in fact get hit. And so he says that he knew that side of it was true. And this is how he finally, as a teenager, put the pieces together of what had been happening in his community and learned about the Holocaust and believed it. The War Refugee Board and the US government, through the War Refugee Board, also laundered money to help sneak refugees into Sweden. So I have talked to sanctions people at the Treasury Department in the past. As you can imagine, the Treasury Department really loves this story because they're the heroes of this story. And they have a few qualms about using the term money laundering here. But I think it's just because they don't want the US to be seen as money laundering, but we definitely were. And you can make up your own mind on that. So the War Refugee Board's representative, who you see here in Sweden, was named Ivar Olsson. He was the Stockholm legation's financial attaché, which sounds to me like a very boring job, except that he was also an OSS spy. So the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, his code name was Crispin. And so when the War Refugee Board, when his friends at the Treasury Department back in Washington said, hey, will you be our representative in Sweden? He now has his cover job, his CIA job, or his OSS job that they don't know about, and now his humanitarian aid job. And he lost 20 pounds over the course of 1944 trying to juggle all three jobs. But he does a very good job for the War Refugee Board. Among other things, he is the man who's responsible for recruiting Raoul Wallenberg, the now famous Swedish businessman. Remember how I said that the board was putting pressure on the neutral nations, pass on information, protest what the Nazis are doing. After the invasion of Hungary, they added another request, which is send more diplomats to Hungary. Send them, spread them throughout the country, have them act as deterrents to violence or as witnesses to what is happening, and send that information back and give it to us in the United States. And one by one, all of the countries said no, except for Sweden. And Sweden says, who do you want to send? And Ivar Olsson worked in the same office building as a young export importer named Raoul Wallenberg, who had a Hungarian business partner. And so within about a month, Raoul Wallenberg is on his way to Budapest, where, as we know, he sets up safe houses, he issues thousands of protective papers, and saves thousands of lives in this effort, which he considered, and this is a quote from Wallenberg, an American project. That is not the money laundering story. The money laundering story is that in the summer of 1944, Ivar Olsson, who again you see here, focused on a plan to bring refugees out of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia by water. He wrote to the War Refugee Board that he needed, quote, the most skillfully organized type of underground operations because the Baltic countries are now sealed to everything. But he thought if he could get the right amount of money, he could get between 600 and 700 intellectual, racial, and political refugees out of each of those countries. The War Refugee Board pays for this project directly out of the funds from President Roosevelt. They had a secret fund that they didn't need to report to the press. They didn't need to tell Congress how they were spending it. And so they used this money. But they were very nervous about putting a large deposit into a Swedish bank. That would be very suspicious, especially during the war. And the War Refugee Board wanted to avoid any sort of impression that the US is funding unregulated refugee entry into a country that we're friends with. And even Swedish Jews, Olsson told them, and this is a quote, are very interested in Jewish rescue and relief operations so long as they do not involve bringing them to Sweden. So John Paley, who again had been the head of the US sanctions program, responsible for keeping companies from sending money into enemy territory, decides to use everything he learned to have his War Refugee Board sneak money into Sweden. And what he does is he contacts the Goodyear Tire Company in Akron, Ohio, the corporate headquarters, and he says, we're going to give you $50,000. You're going to put that on your books. Your factory in Norrköping, Sweden is then going to give $50,000 worth of Swedish kroner to Ivar Olsson. This is easy and early money laundering. That's exactly what it is. Olsson gets the money. There are no references to this deal in any of the War Refugee Board's papers. I went through all 120 boxes. I read through everything. I have a massive database that we can talk about later with every single document coded, notes, keywords, searchable. No reference in the War Refugee Board's papers, except for one reference in the financial ledger that just says Goodyear tire, $50,000. And so I became obsessed with trying to figure out why they did this, what this was. And I realized that the War Refugee Board, clearly somebody scrubbed the records. Clearly somebody removed all of the Goodyear tire stuff. But Henry Morgenthau, as I mentioned, very good record keeper, and they forgot to scrub his records. And so this document is actually from the Morgenthau papers. And you can see here, this arrangement worked well. And although not foolproof, it's desirable from a security point of view. At this time, we do not recommend bank transfers, as receipt of cable transfers of such size by individuals involved in operations unavoidably attract notice and suspicion. So Olson gets his money. He buys speedboats and guns with it. He recruits underground operations out of Sweden. So some of the emigre groups, people who had escaped from those countries into Sweden years earlier, and tasks them with taking the speedboats across the North Sea, landing on the beaches, recruiting refugees to get on the boats, and then landing them on the islands off the coast of Sweden. It begins terribly. People are arrested by the Swedes. People are arrested and taken to concentration camps by the Nazis. He is unable to rescue, as far as we can tell, a single Jewish refugee because, well, for one, the Jewish communities of those countries are largely gone and had been gone for years at that point. But also the people who had survived in those countries had been in hiding for years and were very nervous, understandably, about emerging from hiding, trying to make it to the beach and then boarding a speedboat to get to Sweden. But Olson does manage to rescue about 4,000 people. He finally is able to get them to islands off the coast of Sweden, but it is unclear whether those people are really escaping the Nazis or whether they're escaping the Soviets, which were about to liberate that area. So most of the people are political refugees, not Jewish ones. In Switzerland, which is completely surrounded by Nazi territory and had been since the fall of 1942, the War Refugee Board recruits Roswell McClelland, who was an aid worker with the American Friends Service Committee, or the Quakers. McClelland and his wife had gone to Europe in 1940. They had set up a Quaker relief office in Rome first, helping people put their paperwork together for immigration, giving small amounts of relief to Jewish refugee families who were trying to escape out of Germany. In 1941, when the U.S. consulate closed, forced by the Germans and the Italians to close, they moved on to southern France, where he and his wife worked inside French internment camps, inside Gurs and Les Milles, distributing aid to the internees, to the prisoners, and choosing children to go to the U.S. as unaccompanied minors. Their parents would give away permission, and these children would go as part of children's transport. And Ross's wife, Marjorie, was in charge of choosing the children. They also, we think, were some of the people who were secreting children out of the camps and placing them into orphanages and children's homes prior to deportation from those camps. So, and they were doing this in their 20s. He's now 30. He has escaped over the border with his wife into Switzerland to run the Quaker operation out of Geneva and just kind of wait out the war in Switzerland. So when the War Refugee Board comes in the spring of 1944, they need somebody on the ground. He is someone with a lot of contacts. He is also very young, but experienced. And so much of his work involves Jews deep inside Nazi territory, in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania. And among a lot of other things, he participates in ransom negotiations with the Nazis. The Nazis are looking around, they're seeing the same situation as everyone else. The Allies are likely going to win the war. And so maybe we can get something for these Jews that the Americans seem to care about. And so high-ranking Nazis offer Jews for sale. The US is never going to pay ransom, but they see value in stringing the Nazis along, trying to keep these people, again, alive long enough to be liberated. So McClellan and Sally Meyer, who is the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee's representative in Switzerland, managed to string along a group of high-ranking Nazis for about 7 months. In November 1944, Ross even goes to Zurich and in one of the fancy hotels in the banking district, meets with SS Obersturmbannführer Kurt Becker, who reported directly to Adolf Eichmann and was wearing his SS uniform during the meeting. And Ross pretended that he was President Roosevelt's personal emissary to conduct these ransom negotiations. He never told the War Refugee Board staff that he had done this. It only comes out after the war, when some of the other people who were in the meeting start talking, that he ever admitted that he had actually met with an SS officer during the war. But you see that there is an American representative negotiating for the fate of Jews directly with the SS in the fall of 1944. And as a result of that meeting, they got 1,600 Jews released from Bergen-Belsen and dumped on the border of Switzerland as a gesture of good faith on behalf of the Nazi, or on the part of the Nazis. Beyond all of this, the War Refugee Board opened a refugee camp in upstate New York. They brought nearly 1,000 mostly Jewish refugees to live there. They argued that the Nazis, and this is a quote, must not be given the pretense of justification that the Allies, while speaking in horrified terms of the Nazi treatment of Jews, never once offered to receive these people. And so this is, again, the US is putting pressure on other nations. Those nations are turning around and saying, well, why aren't you opening? Why aren't you taking more refugees? This is the first and only group of refugees brought outside of the immigration system. And it really is the precursor to our current refugee system. This is the first group that we ever bring, as far as I can tell, for humanitarian reasons during a conflict. They sent 300,000 food packages into concentration camps in the final weeks of the war. So these were packaged on Long Island, about 300,000 of them, and then shipped across the Atlantic to land either in Sweden or in southern France, disguised as Red Cross packages and distributed by the International Red Cross to Dachau, to Ravensbrück, to Bergen-Belsen, to Buchenwald, and to people on the sides of roads as parts of forced marches in the spring of 1945, right before liberation. They pass along requests to the War Department to bomb the gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz, or even some requests came in to wipe the camp off the face of the earth, just bomb everything. And of course, the War Department continuously said that this was not their priority. They also gave Americans detailed information on the process of arrival and selection and gassing at Auschwitz. Yeah, there is the first slide. So in the fall of 1944, the War Refugee Board got a report that was written by escapees from Auschwitz, and it's very detailed, it's very graphic. And the War Refugee Board originally said, the American people need to know about this. And they tried to give the news to Yank magazine, which was the soldiers magazine. And Yank came back, Yank was run by the War Department. And the reporters said, we actually need a story that's less Semitic. And the War Refugee Board said, well, the whole thing's Semitic. And so, no, we are not going to collaborate with your story anymore. And instead, the War Refugee Board, without asking anyone's permission, sent this report to 200 newspapers nationwide. They embargoed it. And so on Thanksgiving weekend, 1944, Americans could read this very graphic report that the Nazis are murdering people using Zyklon B gas chambers in Auschwitz-Birkenau. So it's very graphic process of arrival and selection and gassing. This is the Louisville Courier, that Thanksgiving weekend, 1944. And this, you can see even at the top that they've included a diagram from the report where you can see where the gas chambers and crematoria were located. And in response, the Washington Post issued an editorial a few days later entitled Genocide. This was a new word, and this is one of the first times that word appears in an American newspaper. This was a word that had been devised by a Polish Jewish legal scholar who had said, this is a new kind of crime, what the Nazis are doing. And the Washington Post agreed and wrote this editorial saying, the War Refugee Board has just introduced the American people to this new crime, and we need to learn this new word to describe it. So in conclusion, the War Refugee Board's creation was and remains the only time that the US government tries to do anything like this. The only time we create a new agency dedicated with saving the lives of the victims of our wartime enemy. And so the 21 months that the board exists between its creation in January 1944 and its closing in September 1945 represents this moment when American action is matching American rhetoric and the things that we say about our democratic values. And in contrast to many subsequent human rights efforts, there's no secondary cynical motive. This is not about a larger program to gain overseas prestige or power. It is not about favor or influence over a minority group. The refugees in peril, most of them had no idea that the United States had any interest in their survival or anything that happened to them. They were never intended to become Americans. That was not part of it either. They did not know. Historian Yehuda Bauer, who is historian emeritus at Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial and Museum, wrote, "What made the WRB such a unique body is it was officially permitted to break practically every important law of a nation at war in the name of outraged humanity." And so one of the things that I'm hoping with this book and with the Florentine film and with all of the kind of things that I'm trying to do to talk about the War Refugee Board, I'm hoping that it starts to enter our public narrative because I think it's a really relevant history. Not only does it show that the US government can be slow to change, but can change and can change in the favor of refugees. They are debating many of the challenges that still face us today. So they are debating the role of ransom negotiations to save the lives of innocent victims. They are debating between providing relief for a lot of people or trying to use that same amount of money to rescue only a few people. They're talking about how to bring refugees to the US when there are real national security concerns. How many resources can we allow to fall into the hands of the enemy? All of these are things that they are debating in World War II, and we debate them today as if it's the first time. So while the US could have done much more to aid Jews and other Nazi victims, especially during the 1930s, when we could have opened up immigration, what the War Refugee Board staff did mattered. And I think we need to remember it both to honor their efforts, to bring greater nuance to our understanding of American responses to the Holocaust, and also to study their work as we continue to confront challenges today. So at this point, I'm interested to talk about whatever you want to talk about. And we have about, I'm looking at like 13 minutes or so to go. And so I am going to look at the Q&A and at the chat. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in one of those places. So the first question I'm seeing is Rebecca asking, why did the US and allied governments wait until 1943 when groups like the Emergency Rescue Committee, Varian Fry, and the Unitarians, the Sharps, were working to rescue Jews as early as 1939? This is an excellent question. One is that I think the US was still trying to decide what our role in the world was going to be. You know, this is still 1939, 1940, 41 is still a period in which the United States is neutral, technically neutral in the war. And Roosevelt is focused on using his political capital to move a very isolationist nation onto a war footing. He believes that at a certain point that the war is inevitable and that the US is eventually going to get involved. And so how do you prepare for that? How do you get a peacetime draft passed? How do you get Lend-Lease passed? How do you get cash and carry through? And so he has focused on all of that and is not focused on creating any sort of immigration agency, opening immigration further, or even really paying attention to what the State Department is doing and the new regulations the State Department is putting in. And so I think it was a political calculation, in my estimation. So I'm seeing, where did you find your sources and what surprised you most? I found the majority of the War Refugee Board's records are at the FDR Library in Hyde Park. I was able to get some of them on microfilm, and the rest I went up to Hyde Park, and which is beautiful and right next to the Culinary Institute, which makes it a really good place to do research. So I spent about 2 years photographing the entirety of the War Refugee Board collection and then putting it in chronological order. So the War Refugee Board's records, it's about 120 boxes, and they're in two main series. There's a correspondence series and there's a subject series. And the correspondence series is by either the name of the person writing or the organization that person worked for. And the subject series is what it was about, what the letter was about. And so you can see that the secretary could have put it in one of three places, everything in one of three places. Either this is what this letter was about, or this is the name of the person who wrote it, or the organization that they worked for. And so things could be anywhere. And what I learned was that historians before me who were writing about the War Refugee Board as part of larger projects had really only looked at the subjects series and had only looked at the couple of folders. You know, if I'm writing about what the War Refugee Board was doing in Turkey, I'm looking at the Turkey subject folder, right? And missing everything else. And so I, again, spent 2 years without writing a single word, photographing the entirety. And then I came up with a very elaborate kind of naming structure for all of the PDFs that I was creating. So that when I put it all in one folder, it sorted chronologically, no matter where it was in the collection, no matter what archive I got it from. So I was adding in things from the Morgenthau diaries. I met family members and was able to copy some of their things. And so it became I ended up with about 42,000 PDFs of various sizes, representing everything that I could find on the War Refugee Board. And then I started reading through. And the book is not as chronological as my doctoral dissertation was. My doctoral dissertation was also on the War Refugee Board. And then this is the results of, now I've gotten that, you know, larger piece out of the way. Let me tell you the really good stuff and the really interesting story and like the story that I want to tell. And so that's what this book is. So I'm really proud of the research. It is still the way that I work when I'm writing. And thanks for asking. There's a question about the ship that was turned away. So you're talking about the MS St. Louis. The MS St. Louis sailed from Germany in May 1939. It was actually not aimed at the United States. It was aimed at Cuba. Most of the passengers had Cuban landing certificates that they had purchased from a corrupt Cuban official. And when they arrived in Cuba, for various reasons, including the corruption of the official, the Cuban government refused to let the passengers land. And so for about a week, aid organizations and diplomats were negotiating for the fate of those passengers to allow them to land in Cuba, which they had paid to be able to do. So none of the passengers had immigration visas or entry visas into the United States, which became the sticking point. The US refused to make any sort of exception to our entry paperwork, feeling that if we did so, then what's to stop another group of people from just renting a boat and trying to land on the shores of the US? So the argument was, well, we don't even have an immigration system if we let these people in. And so instead, American aid workers and State Department people, there were actually a couple of State Department people who helped with this, negotiated with the governments of Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium to divvy up the passengers so that none of them would have to return to Germany. So none of the St. Louis passengers are returned to Germany, but 3 of those countries would be invaded by Nazi Germany within a year. And we know that about a third of the passengers of the St. Louis were murdered in the Holocaust. Where in upstate New York was the refugee camp located? Oswego, New York. So right on the shores of Lake Ontario, a little bit north and east of Syracuse. There is still a museum up there. Fort Ontario is a state park. And right off the grounds, there's a museum called Safe Haven that's run by really wonderful members of the community and volunteers to kind of dedicate and memorialize the lives of the refugees who lived there. They actually lived there until the January and February 1946. There was a long debate over what to do with them after the war was over. They had all signed papers saying that they would voluntarily go back to Europe after the end of the war. And they didn't want to, of course. They had gone to school here. You know, some of the people even had American children, like children who had managed to make it to the US and were fighting in the US military. And so there was a lot of pressure to allow them to stay. There are congressional hearings about it. And it finally takes Truman in December 1945 to announce that he would allow them to stay within the immigration system. So they all have to go to Canada, register at the Niagara Falls consulate, and then they can enter the US as future citizens. I have not read the book, The Escape Artist, yet. That's the book. It's a fairly new book, I think, on Rudolf Verba, who was one of the escapees from Auschwitz. And so that's one I'm very interested to read, because I met Verba much earlier in my career. He passed away a long time ago. And he's an amazing, amazing person. Who financed my work to write the book? I did. I have a day job. I'm a historian at the Holocaust Museum in DC, which this work is mine. And so everything I've said today is my own opinion and not the opinion necessarily of the museum. And so I did all of my graduate work and then wrote the book on nights and weekends and did all of that ridiculous working full time and all the time sort of thing that I've never quite gotten rid of. How many Jews did the US Rescue Board save in total compared to the 6 million who were exterminated? A very small number in comparison. I mean, it really does look like a drop in the bucket compared to a number like 6 million. The board was never able to come up with a full statistic of this is exactly who we saved, because a lot of what they're doing in terms of food packages, false papers, that sort of thing, is not something that you can necessarily then count afterwards. And so a lot of what they're doing is second and third hand rescue work. They're enabling rescue workers. They're enabling relief to happen. So they estimated that they had likely saved tens of thousands of lives and helped hundreds of thousands of people. And I, having read through everything I have read through, I think that that's a pretty safe estimate. It is a drop in the bucket compared to 6 million, but if it's your family, it doesn't matter. And the fact that this is a model that the US could adopt again is something that makes it worthy of study to me. So that's everything that's in the Q&A. And there's some really lovely chat messages. Thank you. Somebody said Germany went into Poland in 1939. Yes, if I said 1938, I apologize. You are correct. The invasion was September 1st, 1939, and the war began 2 days later. Eleanor Roosevelt was very involved in getting Jewish children out of Germany and France. Yes, this is the same rescue effort that Marjorie McClellan is involved in. It was called the U.S. Committee to say, no, I'm getting all my committees mixed up. USCOM, the U.S. Committee for Children. I write about this. Oh, it's been a long week. I'm sorry, everyone. Yes, Eleanor Roosevelt is incredibly involved in that. She was the honorary chairwoman of this organization that was originally aiding British children escaping the Blitz, and then moved on to southern France. And there are about 300 USCOM children. It's generally known as USCOM. So if you just say USCOM, people will understand you, I hope. And was Frances Perkins the first female labor secretary, huge hero of mine. Good job on Frances Perkins. Working through her contacts to get people out. She was trying. The INS, in Immigration and Natural, or not INS, the Border Patrol was actually under the Department of Labor until 1940. It moves over to Justice and to what is now Homeland Security, but Justice. It moves over to Justice in June 1940 as immigration and the border goes from being a question of labor, you know, how many people can move in and out for labor, to being a question of national security. So she loses a lot of her influence over immigration, not necessarily who is getting immigration, but how many people are coming and where they're going. She loses that influence in 1940. But she's an amazing person and another person who completely stands up to history. She should be much better known. I don't know anything about the Kiwanis organizations doing this kind of work. I wouldn't be surprised, but I've not come across them anywhere. Committee for the Care of European Children, the U.S. Committee for the Care of European Children. Thank you, Michael Haley Goldman, for putting that in the chat for me. That is the official name of USCOM, the U.S. Committee for the Care of European Children. There's another question in the chat, and then we're at 6 o'clock, so I'm going to make this my last one. Why did the U.S. refuse to receive displaced persons after the war? I'm sorry that we're ending on a depressing note. yes, the US does refuse to receive many displaced persons after the war, and we have incredible criteria for the displaced persons that we do receive. This is largely because American feelings about refugees and immigrants did not markedly change even after the Holocaust, even after we saw images of concentration camps and of liberation. And so it takes a long time for even a displaced persons bill for those people to come outside of the immigration system. We make it really hard. We put them through a lot of security. We make them have financial sponsors, all sorts of things. It was for the exact same reasons. They take jobs, they're not the right people. Even with Holocaust survivors, they said, look how sick they are. We don't want them to bring disease here, which I don't know how to answer that or to deal with that, but it is an important part of our history that I think we need to learn about. So thank you all for joining me.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone for your questions and comments. Please join us again on February 17th at 5 p.m. when Dr. Vaughn A. Booker of Dartmouth College will present Lift Every Voice and Swing, which will explore the religious lives of some of America's jazz greats, including Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, and Mary Lou Williams. For more information about this and other future events, please visit our website, nhhhumanities.org, check out our social media platforms, or sign up to receive our e-news, which we send out each month. Thank you again to the National Endowment for the Humanities and to all New Hampshire residents for your ongoing support of our work. If you would like to continue to support us, please visit our website, nhhhumanities.org. Once this program ends, you will receive an email with a link to take a survey on the program. We thank you for your time and appreciate the feedback you provide, as it helps us to continue to improve the work that we do. So I think that's a wrap for tonight, and we'll see you all again in February.